Here is the paradox you are not supposed to say out loud. After 48 days of airstrikes, 3,400 dead, $11 billion spent, and the largest Israeli military operation since 1973, Iran's uranium enrichment program is not only intact, it is more politically legitimate, more internationally sympathetic, and more technically advanced than it was the morning the first bombs fell. Map it.
Before the strikes, Iran had an enrichment program under international scrutiny, operating under NPT obligations subject to IAEA inspection. After the strikes, Iran has an enrichment program that it has now publicly suspended inspections on that has the documented moral high ground of having been attacked by a nuclear-armed state while being a non-nuclear NPT signatory, and that is drawing quiet but unmistakable signals of interest from three of its regional neighbors, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, who watched the entire 48 days and drew their own conclusions about what deterrence actually requires. The war nobody won is not a phrase, it is a forensic verdict. And the map of who inherited what from this conflict is not the map being drawn in the press coverage. Tonight, I want to draw the real one.
I study how military operations reshape strategic maps, not just on the ground, but in the calculations of every neighboring state that watches and updates its own threat model accordingly. What the historical record shows, consistently, is that strikes on nuclear programs produce a predictable set of second-order effects that planners almost always underestimate. They delay the program by months or years, they accelerate the political will to complete it, and they reorder the regional security calculus in ways that extend far beyond the original target. 48 days, 3,400 dead, $11 billion. Let me show you what that bought, and what it cost.
One sentence. The 48-day war against Iran's nuclear infrastructure achieved the opposite of its stated objective. It transformed Iran's enrichment program from a diplomatic liability into a sovereign legitimacy asset and simultaneously triggered a nuclear recalculation in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt that will define Middle Eastern security architecture for the next generation. Map the targets first. The Israeli operation, with U.S. logistical and intelligence support, struck documented facilities. Fordow, the deeply buried enrichment site in Qom province. Natanz, the primary centrifuge complex in Isfahan province. And Arak, the heavy water reactor that had been the subject of years of IAEA monitoring. These were real targets, and the strikes caused real physical damage. That is not in dispute. What is in dispute, and what the post-strike assessment from intelligence analysts at the Carnegie Endowment, the Rand Corporation, and multiple European security agencies has consistently found, is whether the damage was decisive. Fordow was built specifically to survive conventional aerial bombardment, buried under 80 meters of mountain rock. Structural assessments based on satellite imagery suggest the centrifuge halls sustained partial damage, but the facility's core infrastructure remained intact. Natan's surface structures were destroyed. The underground halls, which had been the primary operational enrichment space since 2020, sustained damage whose full extent remains disputed. More importantly, the uranium was not destroyed. Highly enriched uranium stockpiles, Iran's most strategically significant nuclear asset, had been dispersed in the months preceding the strikes, according to reporting from multiple intelligence tracking sources. The strikes hit the infrastructure. They did not eliminate the material. And in nuclear terms, the material is what matters. You can rebuild a centrifuge hall in 18 to 36 months. You cannot recreate enriched uranium that no longer exists. Iran's still exists. The forensic record of strikes on nuclear programs runs exactly one clean experiment, Osirak, 1981. Israel struck Iraq's nuclear reactor before it became operational in a single strike against an above-ground facility with no dispersed material and no functioning enrichment program. The reactor was destroyed. The program was set back substantially. The operation is still cited as the template for preventive strikes on nuclear infrastructure. What the Osirak template obscures is what happened next. Saddam Hussein's Iraq, following the 1981 strike, massively accelerated its covert nuclear weapons program, the one that IAEA inspectors discovered in 1991 after the Gulf War, and that had come far closer to producing a weapon than the Osirak reactor would have. The strike did not end Iraq's nuclear ambition. It drove it underground, accelerated it politically, and made it covert enough that it took a full-scale invasion and a decade of sanctions to ultimately dismantle. Syria, 2007. Israel struck Al-Kibar, a reactor under construction. The program was set back. Syria had limited uranium infrastructure beyond that facility, so the strategic setback was more durable. But Syria also had no functioning enrichment program, no dispersed material, and no NPT standing to leverage diplomatically in the aftermath. Iran 2026 is neither of those cases. It has a functioning enrichment program, dispersed material, NPT membership it can weaponize diplomatically, and, critically, the documented history of a prior agreement, the JCPOA, that the attacking state's primary sponsor abandoned unilaterally. The inherited context poisons the strategic outcome of the strikes before the first bomb lands. Now map the neighbors. Because the most consequential outcome of the 48-day war is not what happened to Iran's centrifuges. It is what happened to the threat calculations of 3 countries sitting on that map watching the entire operation: Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. Saudi Arabia's calculation is the most direct. Riyadh has been quietly pursuing civilian nuclear infrastructure for years: nuclear power plants, uranium enrichment research, a nascent fuel cycle program, under the framework of its 2017 cooperation agreement with the United States. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said publicly in 2018 that if Iran acquired a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia would pursue one too. That statement was treated at the time as a political warning. After 48 days of watching a non-nuclear NPT signatory get bombed by a nuclear-armed state with no international legal consequence, that statement is now a strategic planning document. The forensic question is not whether Saudi Arabia will pursue a nuclear hedge. It is how quickly and through which pathway. Turkey's calculation is more layered. Ankara is a NATO member with U.S. nuclear weapons deployed on its soil at Incirlik Air Base under the NATO nuclear sharing arrangement. Turkey has no independent nuclear program, but Turkish President Erdogan has made several statements in recent years questioning why Turkey, as a major regional power, should be excluded from nuclear capability that smaller states possess. After watching the 48 days, the domestic political logic of those statements strengthened considerably. Turkey has the industrial base, the scientific infrastructure, and, after the war, the political motivation to begin asking harder questions about its own deterrence requirements. Egypt is the quietest case and potentially the most significant. Cairo has a civilian nuclear program, the El Dabaa nuclear power plant project, under construction with Russian technical assistance. Egypt has also had preliminary conversations with multiple parties about uranium enrichment capability. The 48-day war did not create Egyptian nuclear ambitions, but it provided them with the most powerful argument their advocates have ever had, that in a regional security environment where military strikes on nuclear infrastructure are treated as legitimate by the major powers, the only reliable deterrent is the capability itself. Here is what the strikes produced for Iran diplomatically, which is the dimension the coverage is most consistently underweighting. Before the strikes, Iran's nuclear program was described internationally as a threat to regional stability, a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the NPT, and a source of legitimate international concern. That was the dominant framing in Western media, in UN Security Council debates, and in the diplomatic communications of most major powers. After 48 days, that framing has been substantially disrupted. Iran is now a country that was attacked militarily while being an NPT signatory in active diplomatic communication with Western powers about its enrichment program. The attack occurred without UN Security Council authorization. It was conducted by a state that is not an NPT signatory and possesses an undeclared nuclear arsenal. From the perspective of the Global South, which is to say, from the perspective of the majority of the world's population and the majority of UN member states, the moral geometry of this conflict is not what Western coverage suggests. The UN General Assembly vote following the strikes, which called for an immediate ceasefire and condemned the attacks, passed with a majority that included virtually every African, Latin American, and Asian state outside of the immediate U.S. alliance system. That vote has no binding force, but it maps the international terrain precisely. Iran's enrichment program now has more international political support than it had before the war. That is not a successful outcome for the side that launched $11 billion of airstrikes. Map the costs. The $11 billion figure represents the documented combined expenditure of the operation: Israeli Air Force sorties, munitions costs including bunker-busting ordnance that required direct U.S. transfer, intelligence support, naval positioning, the air defense activation costs on both sides, and the economic disruption of 48 days of regional conflict. That figure does not include the Iranian civilian infrastructure damage, the regional humanitarian costs, or the economic impact of oil market disruption during the operation. $11 billion is, for context, approximately 4 times the annual budget of the IAEA, the organization whose inspections the strikes have now suspended. It is roughly equivalent to the cost of 3 years of the diplomatic engagement track that produced the 2015 JCPOA. It bought 48 days of operations that, by the most optimistic assessment from analysts at the RAND Corporation and the Institute for Science and International Security, set Iran's enrichment program back by somewhere between 12 and 36 months. The arithmetic of that exchange is not complicated. The strikes cost $11 billion and achieved, at best, a 3-year delay. Iran's enrichment program costs approximately $1 to $2 billion per year to operate. The strikes therefore cost roughly the same as financing Iran's entire enrichment program for 5 to 11 years, in exchange for delaying it by 3. This is not a successful cost-benefit calculation. It is the definition of institutional failure dressed up as military achievement. Map the human cost against the strategic outcome. 3,400 dead, Iranian civilians, Iranian military personnel, and the documented deaths among Israeli aircrew and personnel involved in the operation represents a human cost that demands an honest accounting of what it purchased strategically. The answer, forensically, is less than nothing. Iran's nuclear program is intact. Iran's political legitimacy on the nuclear question is stronger than before. The regional proliferation calculus has shifted in the direction that the strikes were supposed to prevent. The international legal framework governing strikes on nuclear facilities has been weakened, not strengthened. The IAEA inspection regime that provided the world's only real-time visibility into Iran's program is suspended, meaning the international community now has less information about Iran's nuclear activities than it did before the war. 3,400 people died to make the world less informed, less legally stable, and more proliferation-prone than it was 48 days earlier. That verdict does not fit comfortably in a press release, but it is what the map shows. Every major actor in this architecture now faces a map that looks worse than the one they started with. Israel launched the operation to eliminate an existential threat. It produced a threat that is politically stronger, diplomatically better positioned, and surrounded by neighbors who are now accelerating their own deterrence calculations. The military objective was not achieved. The strategic objective was actively reversed. The United States provided logistical and intelligence support for an operation that it privately assessed, according to reporting from the Financial Times and Haaretz, had a low probability of achieving decisive results against dispersed and hardened targets. Washington chose alliance management over strategic honesty. It is now managing the consequences of a regional map it helped redraw in the wrong direction. Iran emerged from 48 days of bombardment with its program intact, its political position strengthened, and the most powerful argument it has ever had for why its deterrence requirements are legitimate. The war it did not start produced the outcome its negotiating position had never been able to achieve: a regional consensus that Iran has a sovereign right to defend itself against military attack, including through whatever means it deems necessary. Scenario 1. Iran reconstitutes its enrichment infrastructure within 18 to 36 months and resumes enrichment at higher levels than before the strikes, citing the suspension of IAEA inspections as a sovereign response to an unprovoked attack. The international community lacks the legal and diplomatic tools to re-engage Iran on the same terms as before. A new framework, if one is negotiated, will require acknowledging Iran's right to enrichment as a starting point, a concession that was not on the table before the war. Scenario 2. Saudi Arabia activates its nuclear hedging strategy through a civilian enrichment program that it declines to place under the additional protocol. It cites Iran's experience as evidence that NPT membership does not provide security guarantees. Turkey begins a quiet internal review of its NATO nuclear sharing arrangements. Egypt accelerates its El Daba infrastructure. The Middle East enters a proliferation cascade that no existing international framework is equipped to manage. Scenario 3. A new multilateral diplomatic process is launched, this time necessarily including Russia, China, and regional powers, that attempts to negotiate a comprehensive Middle Eastern security framework, including a nuclear weapons-free zone concept or a regional deterrence architecture that addresses all actors' security concerns simultaneously. This is the most constructive possible outcome. It is also the one that requires the most political courage from the most actors simultaneously, making it the least likely in the near term. Scenario 4. The status quo of managed uncertainty persists. Iran does not reconstitute visibly. Saudi Arabia hedges but does not weaponize. The IAEA eventually negotiates a partial return of inspection access. The regional map looks superficially similar to pre-war, but with every actor operating at a higher level of latent nuclear capability and lower level of institutional trust. This is not stability. It is a longer fuse on the same device. If you are skeptical of the narratives being handed to you about this conflict, the map I just drew is why. The institutional failure here is not a matter of opinion. It is documented in the arithmetic. $11 billion for a 12 to 36-month delay. 3,400 dead for a diplomatic outcome worse than the one available through negotiation. A regional proliferation cascade that the strikes were explicitly designed to prevent, now advancing faster than before. The institutions that are supposed to prevent this kind of outcome, the UN Security Council, the NPT framework, the IAEA inspection regime, were either bypassed, ignored, or damaged by the operation. The frustration you feel watching this is not irrational. It is the correct response to watching a system fail in exactly the way its critics have always said it would fail. Powerful states do what they want, absorb no institutional consequences, and leave the rest of the international architecture to manage the damage. The map after 48 days shows a Middle East with more nuclear ambition, less institutional oversight, weaker legal norms, and a cleaner moral argument for proliferation than existed before the first bomb fell. Understanding that map does not make you anti-Israel or pro-Iran. It makes you someone who is reading the actual strategic outcome rather than the press release version of it. Let me draw the final map. 48 days, 3,400 dead, $11 billion. Iran still has its uranium. The IAEA inspectors are out. Saudi Arabia is running the numbers. Turkey is asking questions its NATO partners are not comfortable answering. Egypt is building a reactor with Russian help and watching carefully. The war nobody won produced a clear set of winners in the strategic accounting, and they are not the parties who launched it. The winners are the argument for nuclear deterrence, which has never been stronger in the Middle East than it is today, and the countries that were already building toward a capability they can now justify more easily than at any point in their modern history. The poisoned inheritance of this conflict is simple. Every state in the region that does not already have a nuclear deterrent watched 48 days of bombing of a non-nuclear NPT signatory and updated its own threat model accordingly. That update is not reversible. It is now baked into the strategic planning documents of at least 3 major regional powers. No diplomatic process, no new inspection regime, no reconstructed international framework will erase the lesson that 48 days just taught. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If you were advising the government of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or Egypt right now, looking at this map, doing this arithmetic, what would you recommend? Leave your answer in the comments. The most strategically rigorous responses I will read in the follow-up.